Welcome to the 4HistoryBuffs at the Missoula Public Library. My name is Lee Silliman. I'm one of the 3 members of the Planning Committee. Maria is another one. And our fearless leader is in the hospital right now, Paulette Parpart. And I visited her this afternoon. She had an operation on her leg, and she's going to be hobbling around for a while and hopes to get back maybe in a week or 2. And anyway, we're trying to plan the next 3, or the first 3 months of the years, January, February, and March, and we're busy trying to get that all sewed up. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I want to tell you about the next speaker in November. It is going to be Tate Jones, and it's going to be about the War of 1812. I call it like America's Forgotten War. I took an interest in it, reading a book about the warfare against the Native Americans in the central part, like Indiana and Illinois, and that actually figured into the War of 1812. I mean, we all kind of know that the War of 1812 was when the Star-Spangled Banner was written and Washington, D.C. was burned, and probably the rest of it you didn't know. Or there's a whole lot that happened in the War of 1812 besides those 2 important events. So I hope you all show up for that. And then the next month in January, we're going to have Raphael Chacon. Oh, by the way, let me back up. Tate Jones is the director of the Montana Military Museum out there at the fort. And he's a walking encyclopedia. I told him to dial it down to an hour because he could talk all day on practically every conflict we've ever had. But Raphael Chacon will be our January speaker on art and politics. And we've got a list over here to pick up if you haven't done so that lists what we're going to do. Hopefully you have your cell phones turned off. We're being recorded, so at the end I'll try to be the monitor, and in order to pick up the sound well, would you wait and raise your hand, and I'll run over with this microphone like they do at the Molly program, and you can ask your question. That way it'll get recorded. So it's my pleasure to introduce Suzette Dussault, D-U-S-S-A-U-L-T. It's not Dussault, is it? How many people say that to you?
Oh, I think growing up, everyone said Dussault.
Right.
But somehow it flipped somewhere back to its old original.
Well, Suzette, like Jeanette Rankin, was born in Missoula. Like Jeanette, this valley and her family shaped who she was, a true Montanan, with strong beliefs in the integrity and the power of the individual, which Jeanette brought to the suffragette movement in Montana. Suzette is a former teacher, librarian, small business owner, and a very amateur historian who loves the journey of discovering the old and how it informs the new. So, welcome.
Thank you, Lee. Thank you. And I want to thank you all for being here, and to Ron and Joel and Scott and Kate and all from MCAT for saving this for posterity. I appreciate that. So this is a story that I started about 20 years ago, or 30 years ago, actually. As someone who was asked by a fellow teacher if I knew anything about Jeanette Rankin, and this was a classroom in Missoula, and I was a fellow teacher, and she was doing a biography unit with her 3rd graders, and was encouraging them to dress as the part, dress as the subject. And so she came into my classroom and she said, "Would you spontaneously appear as Jeanette Rankin in my classroom?" And I was probably in my 40s at the time, early 50s, and growing up in Missoula, I had no idea who Jeanette Rankin was. I didn't know anything about her, which is a tragedy, and I think we're rectifying that, because to me, she's one of the most remarkable persons that I can think of. And so I think part of that is that The Republicans did not want to own her. The Democrats would probably claim her because she was mostly followed Democratic philosophy and principles. So I just think that she was lost to us. And I'm so very happy I was introduced to her at that age in my life. When growing up in Missoula, I had never heard of her. And so I said, of course I will. I mean, you would say that anyway, whether you were going to be anything or anybody. And so I went ahead, and then at the same time, there were a group of wonderful people, Mary Ellen Stube and, I'll think of it in a minute, Sherry Frazier from the cemetery board was interested in inaugurating a series at the cemetery called Stories and Stones. And somehow they knew that I was speaking as Jeanette Rankin, or I had done a little thing as Jeanette Rankin, so they asked me to speak with that. And I think that was about 20 years ago. We just came back after COVID hiatus the last 2 years, and we had a wonderful storytelling again at the cemetery. And so anyway, I invite you next year to join us. It was fun. And tell a story if you'd like. So anyway, so I am thrilled to be able to bring Jeanette Rankin to life. Sometimes I speak as her, especially if I feel like it's appropriate to give a stump speech, like as if I were advocating for women's suffrage in 1914, as she did, as you will hear in our talk. But sometimes I will speak as her. Tonight I not as her, but of her. So tonight I will speak of her and the remarkable story of the resiliency, the drive, the tenacity, the get it done kind of attitude of Montanans in 1914. And you will see why I speak so highly of that, of our Montana ancestors and that Montana year. So, because this talk really is not about Jeanette Rankin necessarily, it is about Montana. And you will be proud of our Montana history when you hear it. But we begin at the beginning in 1878 when John Rankin comes from Ontario with his brother Duncan. They are younger sons of probably a family of 5 sons on a farm in Ontario. And there was, of course, no place on the homestead for 5 sons. So Duncan and John find their way to Helena because Helena had been destroyed by a fire and was completely destroyed, and so it needed rebuilding. And being the industrious and maybe, I don't know, very competent, I don't know, builders in those days or carpenters, they came by ferry, or not ferry, but steamboat to Fort Benton, and then they had their worldly belongings in a tool chest that they were going to hoist over to Helena via stagecoach. So, but what happened is that the steamboat ran a shoal just outside of Fort Benton, so they had to haul their worldly goods in this tool chest over the hills into Fort Benton and then grab the stagecoach. So John shows up in Missoula and or in Helena and realizes that Helena had been pretty much rebuilt. So he hears about a little village called Missoula, and he and his brother come to Missoula, and they find that there is a place where their talents could be used and they could maybe make a little money building. So John begins as a carpenter, and one of his first things is to acquire land up Grant Creek, where there was a stand of timber. He buys a sawmill from someone else, and he hauls it up to the Grant Creek, and he, logs some of the forest on the land, and then he uses that lumber to build the first bridge across the Clark Fork River, the First Methodist Church, and several buildings downtown. And so by the time Olive Pickering arrives from New Hampshire with her sister Mandana, because they had heard stories of Montana from their uncle, Sheriff Barry of Missoula County. And so they were curious about it. And of course, they wanted to see what this was like. And of course, both thinking they would become school teachers once they arrived. Well, Mandana took one look around and saw, when she got off the stagecoach after being on the steamship, of course, steamboat, she takes one look around Missoula and she decides this is not a fit place for raising children. She promptly gets back on the stagecoach and heads back to New Hampshire. Well, for our good fortune, Olive decides it's a very fit place to raise children, marries John, and they proceed to have 7 children on the family farm, the ranch up Grand Creek. So Jeanette is the oldest, and I believe, although I need to double check this is Jeanette as the oldest in her family. And of course, being the oldest, she is the responsible adult in the family, third adult, and she is one of the caretakers of the children and is kind of always thought of as one of their parents, because she is very strict with her siblings. Anyway, what I love about this portrait also is that we have Philomena included in the picture, although she had passed away at the age of 8 or 9, I think. But she is memorialized in the picture, so she's always in the family portrait. So I want to tell you about Jeanette growing up in Montana, because I grew up in this valley, and certainly my family and my family's story really influenced who I am. I would be a different person if I were probably born even in Corvallis or Lewistown or somewhere else in Montana, because I think Montana has an ability to shape who you are. And I think this is tremendously so for Jeanette and for the time that she was living in. So she was born in 1880, so I may have had that 1878 date a little wrong. He may have come here a little earlier to establish himself before he met Olive. But anyway, she was born on the family farm. The family farm was very typical of farms of families in Montana at that time. It had a dairy, it had dairy cows, it had beef cows, cattle, it had chickens, it had horses, it had all the domestic animals, the dogs, the cats. And it was a self-sustaining, for the most part, place with a garden, with chickens, with fruit trees. And it was designed so, and it was planted so, and it was made so by the efforts of both John and Olive. And it also was a magic land, because it had the hills to roam in, it had the creeks to play in, it had all this notion of wide open space for the kids to roam and to be free. So that freedom was really, truly a sense of who Jeanette was. It was true of me growing up in Missoula, that sense of freedom. The other thing was that there was a sawmill, of course, on the property, and that meant that there were responsibilities for making sure that nobody got hurt in the sawmill. So the sawmill was not a place where you're supposed to go. But of course, being young and 4 or 5 years old, you want to see what's going on. So the sawmill was also a business venture. And so Jeanette, by virtue of her nature, she was curious. And she was very interested in all the goings on, not only, with the sawmill or on the ranch. She knew how to take care of animals, and she knew how to take care of the chickens and the garden and all of that. So, but she was very curious about the sawmill. So one day when the workers were having, the hands were having a hard time manipulating the sawmill, she knew kind of intuitively or instinctively, or by just simply observing, which missing piece or which part would needed, a little adjusting or a little jiggling. And so she would go up and say, I think we need to try it this way. So Jeanette was a very unusual individual in that she was very astute, not only as to how a ranch worked or a farm worked, but how machinery worked. And part of her growing up that influenced who she was typical of many, many farms and ranch kids and families, was that when you saw something that needed to be done, you simply did it. You didn't wait for someone else to do it. You took action, and you were the responsible person to making something work. One time, she was very close with her father, and I'll discuss that a little bit in a minute, but she was very close to her father and was curious about all of the buildings that he was building in Missoula. And one time there was he had a building in the Rankin block, and he was trying to sell it to a prospective buyer, and the buyer insisted that it has to have a sidewalk before he would buy it. Well, Jeanette at this point was fairly, an adult, or, a little bit older, and so she knew that she could kind of tweedle her way with her dad. And her dad, of course, insisted in a Scotch kind of manner that, no, we were not going to build the sidewalk, that didn't come with the sidewalk. But Jeanette saw that something practical had to happen. And so she made arrangements to have the sidewalk built, and then the building was sold. So it's those kinds of experiences that I think shaped who she was. She was inquisitive. She was very bright, although she did not like school very much. She would rather be on the farm. And and she also was very quick at learning things, and also had that belief that when you saw something that needed to be done, you simply did it. And I think that was a farm ethic that many, many families, children and parents alike, shared. So there were a couple of things that happened. Once the family got a little larger, they were interested in making sure that they were at school. So they built a house on 134 Monroe, which is now no longer with us, but it was close to Central School, which is now the MCT Theater, and or MCT. And anyway, so one of the things that Jeanette rebelled against was having to go to school, because she would rather be on the farm and be outdoors and working alongside the men. So, but anyway, so they spent part of their winters in Missoula, and then the summers they'd pack up everything and they'd go to the ranch. So the other thing about her growing up was that her father became fairly politically active, and he would often gather, especially at their home in Missoula, many, many people, the civic leaders, and maybe people passing through who would have an interesting perspective, like maybe a Civil War veteran, or maybe it would be what I want to say, preacher going through, or someone would come around the table. And one of the things that was very much a fact in their family is that the children sat at the table, especially Jeanette. And as she got older, she and her father became really close, and she would sit on the side of his good ear and tell him what somebody had said across the table into his good ear, because he was deaf in one ear. And so she would sit at the table where there was a lot of adult discussion going on, politics, philosophy, current events, what was happening in Missoula, what was happening in the nation, in the world. And from that, she understood that she and her mother, although they were women, sat at the table. They had a place, an even place at the table. And that their voices and were respected, and they were heard as much as any of the men around the table. So this was one of the other things about growing up in this family that particularly shaped who she was. It gave her that notion of equality, and that women were on an equal footing with men. And her father exhibited that in the way he treated his family. There was another thing about that too, that I know what it was. Also, typical of many farm families, the children grew up learning many skills and many abilities. So from her mother, Jeanette learned how to sew, which actually served her well later in life, because she sewed most of her clothing because she couldn't afford the quality that she wanted and the style she wanted, so she made it. She also supported herself as a dressmaker many times. She learned how to cook. She learned how to take care of the children. She learned how to, keep a home, make a home from her mother. From her father, she learned how to operate a farm, how to operate a sawmill, how to build a building, and how to navigate an adult world, or a male pretty much world, doing male-oriented things. Now, this is not so untypical of people at the time. This is very, very true of many people across the West, where the men and the women were working equally. And so, but she had a little more opportunity than other young women her age. She went on to the University of Montana. Education was really important, so all of the children went on to higher education after graduating from Missoula County High School and Central School. And she went on to the University of Montana, which was actually MSU at the time, and studied biology and graduated with a degree in 1902. And at graduation, she was content to be at home. They had a wide social life. They are very, very prominent in the community, and she had a lot of friends, and they had dances, and they had parties, and they had sleigh rides, and all the things that young people were doing at the time. And she was content to be her father's, work along with her father's projects. There was no need to go on to do anything else or go anywhere else. Unfortunately, that world came to an end when her father died of Rocky Mountain spotted fever in 1904, and she was adrift. The whole family was, of course, because he was the primary caretaker. He died very young, and so they were kind of at a loss as to what to do. And Jeanette especially, because she had kind of lost her best friend and her right hand. So her mother sent her to Boston to care for Wellington, because Wellington had a serious illness, and but I think it was more for Jeanette to be able to see a bigger world and to get out of Missoula at a time when she was so despondent. So in 1904, she went to Boston to meet Wellington, and he was a student at Harvard, and of course lived in and socialized with the high society in Boston. And so Jeanette and her cousin who went with her were considered quite a novelty as two young women from Montana. People were very curious as to how these two young women would exhibit themselves, how they would act, what did they look like, and all of this. So, and of course, they were two very young, attractive women, and so they were wined and dined and feted to the best of the high society of Boston could offer. And it was quite an eye-opening experience for Jeanette, because she had never seen this kind of wealth before, nor this kind of experience. But one day, she and her cousin wandered into an area of Boston where young ladies were not supposed to wander. And that was into the poor tenements of Boston, where immigrants from all over the world, mostly Europe, were lost in a big city in America, where they had no money to move any further. They had no language skills. They had no skills which to find employment. And so there, as we know, we've read stories before, and we know, of course, know the history of that, the poverty, the extreme poverty of places like Boston, San Francisco, the big cities where people tended to land. So this was an eye-opener for Jeanette, because she had not seen poverty. In Montana, people would be poor, but you would not know it necessarily. I mean, people would provide for themselves and were pretty self-sustaining, and there was a system in Missoula for being able to provide for yourself. So she was, number one, outraged, and number two, again, that idea that when you see something that needs to be done, you do it. She wanted to fix it. And so she knew now kind of where she had an inkling about what she was going to do. So the next path of her journey, and of course, she's not unlike a lot of young people. She was 22, 23, 24 at the time. And so she started to explore, and she had enough wealth to be able to do a little exploring. So she went to San Francisco and happened upon the San Francisco house. I forget what it's called. Anyway, Hull House, where there were women doing work for the benefit of the poor people in San Francisco. From that experience, she went to the New York School of Philanthropy, which became Columbia University, to study sociology. And then in 1910, she worked in a children's orphanage in Spokane. Well, the orphanage was as best as they could, they were taking care of children. But Jeanette quickly realized that there was nothing she could do for these children. But what she could do is perhaps help the families of these children, where the father maybe had a work injury and could no longer work, where the mother died in childbirth because of poor maternal health care. Or there were other issues. Maybe there was just simply poverty and people needed a hand out and a hand up, or not a hand out so much as a hand up. So anyway, so she then enrolled at the University of Washington in Seattle, and that was where she ran into flyers advertising women's suffrage. And it actually was part of the discussion at her New York School of Philanthropy that what we needed were laws that would address child labor, that would address working conditions in sweatshops and working conditions in factories. And she thought, well, if women had the right to vote, then they would have a voice in how things were being done that affected their home. They would have a voice in mine inspections, mine safety. And so this precipitated an awareness and a belief that this was something that could be done, that needed to be done. And she found what she was looking for. What was it that she really wanted to dedicate her life, her energies to? So in 1910, the state of Washington, she worked with the state of Washington to pass women's suffrage. And when she came home at Christmas, she understood that in 1911 there was going to be a bill introduced to the Montana State Legislature. And so they had formed a society. They had formed a society, and they said, okay, Jeanette, you've had all this experience. You go talk to the legislature. And so she said, of course, I will speak to the legislature, because as a suffrage worker in Washington, she had spoken to hundreds of people. She had gone to gatherings. She had stood on the street corner. She had gathered people around her, and she had an ability to speak. One of the things that they noted about her in her work with women's suffrage was that she had a singularly sweet personality. Although she was discussing things very serious and actually asking people to do something, to take action. She had a dashing and glowing persona. She was noted for her determination, her intensity, her appearance, and her voice. And that she was kind of a glittering personality. She was very, very not abrasive, but very sweet. But she had that Montana ethic of when you see something that needs to be done, you get it done and you work at it. So they noted that her hard work and organization, and that she had rare political skills in understanding how to motivate people and how to get people together to work for an issue. And one commentator said, or one person she worked with said, she has worked day and night, heart and soul, for the measure, which is suffrage, and always in such a manner as to command the utmost respect of her opponents. Her tact, her gentle feminine persuasion, and this is the one I love, her ever-ready logic. She was not going to be fooled by anyone. Made many converts to women's suffrage. So these were exactly the skills that Montana suffragists decided they wanted to have as their spokespersons. So she appears before the 1911 legislature and says a few things. First of all, she was not known by anyone because she had been gone from the state for about 3 years. So she was kind of received with a tepid response and not an overly warm response. But she could read an audience, and she knew that. And she knew how to turn it around. And this is also something I think about her ability. She was very, very sensitive to other people and sensitive to what the needs were of other people. So she turned it around and she said, I was born in Montana. First thing she said. And from that, she warmed the hearts of these hostile legislators who had wanted no part of women's suffrage. They had all been bought and paid for by the Anaconda Company, Anaconda Mining Company, which was actually amalgamated, I think, at that time. And they were told, of course, not to allow women to have the vote or the voice. So anyway, in her remarks, she went on to quote Jane Addams of Hull House. That was what I was trying to remember. Suffrage as women suffrage is simply women pursuing their traditional activities in a larger context. This is quoting Jane Addams. Women couldn't have a home with scarlet fever across the street. It would affect their home, and they would want to have something to say about it. They should have something to say about it. And Jeanette went on to say, it is beautiful and right and good that a woman should care for her children when they have scarlet fever or typhoid. But it is also well and good and beautiful and right that a woman should have a voice in the laws governing the milk from which that typhoid fever comes. And of course, there were no laws at that time. So she kind of made a wonderful appearance when she went to the 1911 legislature. And she went on to say that it is not for myself that I am making this appeal, but for the 6 million women who are suffering for better conditions in their homes and in their workplaces. Women who should be working in more sanitary conditions, under better moral conditions, with equal wages with men, for equal work performed. For them, it is them that I make this appeal. For the 2 million children forced to work in coal mines, in factories, in glassworks, textile mills, sweatshops, or as farm laborers or as fishmongers. It's for them that I make this appeal. And she went on to say that we wonder, is there a concerted effort on the part of some in our great nation to deny the suffrage, to deny the vote to certain groups of Americans, to the immigrants, our colored brothers and sisters, to women, our Native American neighbors. 200 years after the founding of this great nation, it is time that we, the people, have a say in our government. And of course, she was speaking as a woman. And so she made the point that in 1910, when she was speaking, Wyoming, Idaho, Utah, California, Oregon, Washington, Alaska, actually in 1913, Arizona had the vote, but we did not have the vote. And she said, are we Montana women no better? Are we not as good as Wyoming women to make a decision, to have a say, to have a voice in the milk supply from which our milk comes? Are we not to have a say in the working conditions of the lumber yard, the lumber camps, the mills, the smelters, the mines, where our husbands are forced to work? Are we not as good as the women in California to have a say? And so this was their argument that they took before the 1911 legislature. And now, of course, the 1911 legislature was this was not a new issue. It had been brought to them in the 1909 legislature. It in 1907, 1905, 1903, 1901, 1899, 1897, 1895, all the way back to when it was rejected by a very slim vote as part of our Montana Constitution. But we know why it has been rejected, because the mining companies, the railroad barons, the lumber monopoly did not want women to have a vote or have a say in the goings on in the state of Montana. So what we had in Montana was the Standard Oil Company in 1899 purchasing the control of the Anaconda Copper Mining Company, the Boston and Montana and Butte mines. These were mostly Marcus Daly mines, and Marcus Daly was dying. He was very ill at this time, and he decided to sell outrightly or wrongly to the Standard Oil Company, which already had a monopoly on the oil and gas and coal in the United States. So they created a holding company called Amalgamated Copper Company. And then in 1906, I meant to say that in 1900, Marcus Daly did die in New York in November of 1900. So he realized that he needed to get his property in order and provide for after his death. So in 1906, the War of the Copper Kings fell to Heinze and his brothers against Amalgamated and also against Clark. Heinze was finally brought to his knees by the Amalgamated, and he finally sold out to Amalgamated. In 1910, Amalgamated buys all of Clark's holdings, mines and smelters, and so they virtually own 90% of the Butte mines. And so they liquidated in 1915 and became the Anaconda Copper Mining Company. So we go back and forth when we talk about this entity. They amalgamated, liquidated for tax purposes because they were starting to tax these subsidiary companies. So they then decided to pull it all together under the Anaconda Copper Mining Company. So this is the political environment in which the women have been trying to get the vote. So we have this situation in which we have almost virtual control of Montana with this company, with the Amalgamated or Anaconda Copper Mining Company, who not only owned the mines in Butte by 1910 when Clark sells out. They own the smelters, they own the stamp mills, they own the lumber camps up in the northwest Montana. So and even in Missoula. So they have this control, and they do not want women to have the vote. And so so there were a couple of things going on nationally that women were working across the United States to get the vote, because they felt that with the vote they would be able to rectify some of these situations. And so she was talking about some statistics. In the 1880s, 5 million immigrants had come to the U.S. in the 1880s, double the number of any other decade. We had Italians, Austrians, Germans, the Poles, the Hungarians, the Serbians, the Russians. And a lot of them actually ended up in Butte. They sought a new life of opportunity, but found themselves in dire straits, dire poverty, without any money, language, or work skills to survive. And so what they did was they took, of course, industrial jobs, and mostly on the East Coast. So there were 35,000 workers killed each year in industrial accidents each year, and 700,000 injured. For the families, there were many families living on less than $500 a year, while 44 of America's richest families were making $1 million or more a year. And it was for those people that Jeanette and others were working for women's suffrage. In March 25th, 1911, just after her speech to the Montana State Legislature in promoting a suffrage bill, which actually failed it failed because it needed a supermajority, although it had gotten a majority of the vote. It had failed on supermajority. But in March of 1911, 146 Jewish and Italian immigrant women, girls mostly, died in a horrific fire at the Triangle Shirtwaist factory in Manhattan. The factory had operated for years in violation of city fire codes, and these young women leapt to their deaths from 8, 9, 10 stories after finding that fire exits and stairwells had been blocked or locked. So these were the kinds of things that women felt that if they had the vote, they could help to change what they saw was intolerable conditions. So, so a couple of things closer to home were going on. William Clark was elected or anointed United States Senator by virtue of the Montana State Legislature. This was in 1899. So, but he went before the United States Senate, and they refused to seat him because of the bribery that was involved in this appointment, because he bribed the legislators, and they were to anoint him. So again, in 1900, he is again accused. So he resigns from the Senate, and there's a whole bunch of hoopla about it. And one of the best books on that is Malone's book on 2 centuries. It'll talk with all of the ins and outs of that Senate ethics conclusion. Again, in 1900, because the Montana legislature is anointing the Senate, we do not have direct election of senators. Clark is again accused, but this time he is anointed to be our United States Senator, which he serves for 6 years, and then he decides to move to California, where he develops railroads. So that is one thing that a lot of the people in Montana were starting to understand, that this was not the way they wanted their state to be run. In 1903, 15,000 men, from 10,000 to 15,000 men have been suddenly thrown out of work in Montana by the general shutdown of the various works of the Anaconda Mining Company. So this, I have another, whoops. So what it meant was that there were the workers on the hill, the miners on the hill, were shut out of work. The smelters in Anaconda and Great Falls were closed. The lumber camps in the Missoula and in the northwest Montana were closed. The railroad shipyards or railroad yards in Montana were all shut down because the company owned the ship. So this had a huge ripple effect through Montana. And this was almost like the final straw that people said, we have got to maybe do something. But it took them a while to do to actually be able to do anything, because they could not convince the legislature to bring the votes for women, which would be a small step, but it would be a step. So another one of the first environmental suits ever to be brought was in 1909. It was brought to the Anaconda Company by Fred Bliss. The substance of the allegations of the bill was, okay, well, we'll just say this, that a permanent injunction restraining and enjoining the defendants, the Anaconda Copper Mining Company, from operating a certain smelting plant situated near the city of Anaconda, and from treating ores described as containing poisonous and deleterious substances, and for general relief. It was brought, Fred Bliss represented the farmers and ranchers of Deer Lodge County because this was affecting their farms, the livestock and the grain and the agriculture on their farms. So this was another cohort that was deciding that maybe we needed to come out from under the copper collar of the Anaconda Copper Mining Company. So now, as I mentioned before, women's suffrage was not a new idea. It had been brought before. He was in 1895 with a lot of our local Missoula people and Montana people working on it. And so that was 1895, and from 1889 actually on, they were working for women's suffrage because they had seen where neighboring states had women's suffrage. So what is happening is that we see there is starting to be a breakthrough. We have a lot of the men and women coming into the agricultural areas of Montana, into Montana ag lands in the southeast Montana. And they are starting to bring with them progressive ideas from the Midwest. And from that, they start to bring together a farm labor alliance. And from this, they are able to see some progress. In 1906, they have brought this legislature to pass the referendum and the initiative in Montana. So an initiative can be brought by the people for vote. The direct election of U.S. senators was now a reality. No more William A. Clark kind of folks getting the vote by simply bribing the legislature. We now have the direct presidential primary, where they are given a choice as to who you want to be run as a candidate for president. The establishment of the minimum wage of 16 for mines, smelters, and lumber camps. Repeal of the power of the governor to call out the state militia in labor disputes. And in 1912, one of the crowning is the Campaign Expenditures and Corrupt Practices Act is passed by the people of Montana to stop the way that Montana had been governing itself by having transparency in our elections and transparency in the way our state government operates. In fact, in 1912, in 2012, actually, after the passage of, or the Supreme Court decision 5-4 for the Citizens United, which was a direct contradiction to this. This allows, Citizens United allows money into our campaign without the transparency that this law requires. Our governor, Steve Bullock, who was at the time our attorney general, took this case and said, no, Montana has on its books, it's had it for 100 years, that we have transparency on our election and we know who is donating money to specific candidates. So our governor, who was AG at the time, went to the United States Supreme Court and argued that no, Montanans had stated that this is where we set how we want our elections to run. We also actually passed an initiative which passed in Montana, either by 67 or 72% of the vote, where in 2012, Montanans actually confirmed that this is the law we want our elections to be run under. And that same Supreme Court that gave the 5-4 decision to pass, to allow the Citizens United rule to stand, said no, the Citizens United rule supersedes this law. So I think that this was a really far-reaching law that actually stood the test of time for over 100 years. That it was very far-sighted of this legislature or the people of Montana in 1912 to pass it. So there were some things that were going on, but as things went on, the women decided that 1913 was going to be the year. So they decided to organize, and they created the Montana Women's Suffrage Association. And they lobbied to promote not only Montana women's suffrage, but the Montana National American Women's Suffrage Association. And so what they did was they got together. There were men, women, and children involved in this campaign, and they created the, let's see. Oh, I know where it is. Okay. So they created the Political Equality Club of Missoula, plus a Montana Women's Suffrage Association, plus a number of other entities. And so they got to work not just working for women's suffrage, but they also were going to elect a legislature that was going to, in 1913, pass the women's suffrage finally, once and for all, and bring it to the voters of Montana. For they said it was not an issue to be decided in the legislature, where they always gave it a nay, but in the halls and the farms and the businesses of the people, we the people of Montana, where we the people of Montana had created Montana. So they created associations, and they created a suffrage newspaper, and they created the Montana Equal Suffrage State Central Committee, of which they appointed Jeanette Rankin as their leader. And so they did elect a 1913 legislature, and they did it by nefarious means. They would write letters to them, and they would find them in the grocery store or the market, and they would ask them at a political meeting if they were going to support women's suffrage. And when they were kind of stonewalled and kind of embarrassed in front of the public, they would say, why, of course, we like women's suffrage. And they would give a very popular, they would clap enormously. And so it became kind of a a commitment that they had to make sort of backhand way. But these women were and men were motivated. And so they went to work, and they had a lot of anti-suffrage stuff going on, because not only did the company not want suffrage, but the prohibitionists, but the liquor industry did not want the women to have the vote. So what a vote will not do, it will not change things. It will not raise wages. It will not stop the liquor traffic. A vote cannot eradicate prostitution. But these were all from the women who were opposed to women's suffrage. So there was a lot of anti-women's suffrage propaganda because it's the company and the liquor interests were not interested in women having the right to vote. But we had the Women's Christian Temperance Union who organized and got together in 1911 for the sole purpose of women's suffrage. And they published a publication to promote this. I love this one. This is the Lewistown Women's Civic Club in November, had on their discussion women's suffrage in Montana. How will it benefit the state? How will it benefit the home? And so one of the tactics that Jeanette used was one that she learned from working all over the United States, in California and New York and in Ohio, in that you organize on the precinct level. And this is what makes this such an incredible Montana story, is because she organized women in every precinct in Montana. And they were to report, they were to make sure that their precinct came in for women's suffrage. And if they didn't come in for women's suffrage, at least they knew about it. So you had your responsibility, you had yours, you had yours, you had your responsibility. Jeanette went all over the state to make sure that you and you and you and you and you, someone in each of the areas of Montana, county by county, city by city, would organize and would make sure that there were people committed there for women's suffrage and would make sure that they got out the vote. And so it was fundraising by having fairs and bake sales, and it was fundraising by being at rodeos and powwows and making sure that people knew about the vote for women's suffrage, because for the first time in Montana's history, Montana men could decide whether their wives, their daughters, their aunts, their mothers, their sisters, their neighbors could have the vote. And of course, when the men of Montana were asked, they said, of course, yes. One of the culminating events was this fair, and this is Jeanette Rankin speaking from the back of a car. And I love to tell, when I talk to children, I just love to think of the idea that we had the car before women had the right to vote in Montana. How backwards is that? And so anyway, there were a lot of a newspaper, of course, which was owned by the Anaconda Mining Company, owned all the major newspapers in Great Falls and Anaconda, in Butte, Helena, Missoula, Miles City, Billings, all across the state. They owned them. And so they were printing articles against women's suffrage. Jeanette, though, spoke tirelessly and went to, if she knew that there was a farm where she could speak to someone, if she knew that there was a Grange meeting in Ekalaka, Montana, she went to it. If she knew, or any of the other suffrage workers in Montana, if you knew that the farmers union was meeting, you'd be at that meeting, and you would ask to be given a chance to speak. So this was simply a Montana movement. It was not Jeanette Rankin necessarily, it was Montana people standing up. So the big culminating event was the Montana State Fair in Helena. This is a big event. It was the biggest event of the year. It's where politicians would go and meet people. They would have 50,000 visitors over the course of 4 days. So this was the biggest state event, and they decided they were going to have a booth there. They were also going to have a fair, a parade. Let's see. Let's see. Women march in big parade in Helena. Now, that's not a big splashy story. It does not have a picture to go with it. And the Helena Independent or any of the newspapers that I looked at, none of them had anything major to talk about. But the women were there and they were given some coverage. Let's see. And the suffragists had theirs at the also. Okay, so we're going to go back to the parade for just a minute. All right. So what I really want to emphasize is what a movement this was from the people of Montana. And this was what one of Jeanette's defining characteristics as an individual, as a woman, as a leader, as a politician. She believed in the responsibility and she believed in the individual. She believed in individuals. Individuals had a voice, they had a right, they had a responsibility to stand up and speak up. And she actually gave them a method for doing that, which is important because you've got to have a way to do it. And so she created this system for the people of Montana to stand up, to be outvoted, to be outspent, to be outpublicized by the corporate interests, by the liquor interests, who did not want this ballot measure to pass. The amazing thing is that it did pass. And Montana, as in our true fashion, we are very smart, independent, righteous people. And we know when something is right, it is right. Montana was the first state to pass it in an initiative like this on the first ballot. And that is a testament to the people of Montana working for this initiative. It's also a testament to the astuity of Jeanette and some of the other leaders, because they knew that the ballot had been voted out in many, many places, because the results were either locked into a box, the ballot box was locked with the results inside, so that at the end of the evening, whomever was against the initiative could suddenly pull out of a hat, oh, this is the number in this box, so that the result would fail. So Jeanette knew that this would be happened in other states, and so she made sure that there were women and men at every polling place, particularly in Butte, in Anaconda, in Great Falls, where there was strong company presence, where they knew that in the past they controlled how these men vote, because the men knew specifically which candidate to support and which not to, because there would be retribution. So the point being is that Montanans did pass this initiative, although it's really funny. Helena went for days denying that it was, okay, that was the Suffrage Daily News touting their parade, of course. But these are all naysaying from the Helena Independent Record about the vote. But finally, the Missoula, of all places, called it. They called it finally on November 6th, when Helena was still humming and hawing about whether it actually, was passed or not. And of course, what this is this has nothing to do with suffrage, I don't think. I think this is war, because from the start of World War I, the front pages of all the newspapers were dedicated to war news. And it's really interesting that generally there were no pictures of local events. They did not have photographers out shooting local events at all. The only pictures you will see, photographs, will be of war images, which there are a lot, or they will show the pictures of the movie stars that are coming to the theaters. Oh, the other one are sports. They will have sports images, but they don't have local news. So I was hoping to find a great picture of Jeanette, leading the women's suffrage parade in Helena, but there was no such, I couldn't find it. So anyway, but Missoulian calls it on the 6th, and it took, there's a New York Times on the 6th, but it took, this is Helena Independent finally conceding it, I think, on like the Sunday after. So, but in fact, women's suffrage amendment passed. And again, it was the first state to pass, the only state to pass it on the first ballot. And what I think is really interesting, if you look at this, this map of where women's suffrage came in. Rural eastern Montana, southeast, around Miles City, there was a strong contingent of prohibitionists and a strong contingent of progressives in this area. This area would be the lumber camps, where the men were working under very difficult conditions, very hazardous conditions, with such low pay that they could not afford to live with their families, could not bring their families. This is Ravalli County, which is the prohibition, because Mrs. Hathaway brought in Ravalli County on the basis of prohibition. And so I just think that this is a very interesting map of where we were then and where we are today. I just think that's kind of interesting. So these were the returns. Ravalli County, because of Mrs. Hathaway and her strong belief in prohibition, 70%. Sanders County, I think because of some of the mining going on and the logging, 65%. Missoula, 63%. Stillwater, 62%. Flathead, 61%. All of these were those southeast Montana counties. Deer Lodge and Deer Lodge, which is Anaconda, smelter, Lewis and Clark County didn't pass it. And part of, Butte did not pass it, Silver Bow, because Butte had been under martial law since July of 1914 because of a skirmish, the blowing up of the miners' hall, the Butte Miners Union Hall in July. And so they were under martial law, so no public gathering could be had at all in Butte. So there was no working of women's suffrage in Butte except individual by individual, right? Because you could still talk to your neighbor. But what was interesting is Silver Bow County and Butte, they lifted the martial law on November 5th. So, wonder what that was all about. So this is Montana's story. This is the story of the people rising up against all odds. They were outfunded, they were out-newspapered because the company owned every newspaper. The company owned the railroads, the company owned the logging company, the lumber mills, the company owned the timberlands. And so I have just a couple of things I want to read to you because it sounds hyperbolic, like this is hyperbole, that, oh, it wasn't that bad. But in Malone's book, Battle for Butte, Malone and Rader and Lang were the people to write the definitive history of Montana. And the Battle for Butte was written by Malone, and if you want to know anything, this is a fabulous read. And it's readable, it's not that esoteric, it's very followable, and how the Clarks and the Hineses and the Standard Oil Company dominated our Montana. But what he says in this is really interesting. He calls it his epilogue, or the Battle for Butte, the legacy. At the time of World War II, Bernard DeVoto, who is a Montana historian, writes, "If you don't know what the company is, stranger, it is the Amalgamated Copper Company, and it has usually maintained a more thoroughgoing ownership of Montana's wealth, government, and inhabitants than any other corporation has ever been able to maintain in any other state. It has gutted an American commonwealth on behalf, if not of its stockholders, at least of its manipulators through the years." John Gunther would write, "To say that the story of Montana is a story of a struggle between the people and a corporation, the Anaconda Mining Company, would be to oversimplify. Anaconda, a company aptly named as like a boa constrictor, has a constrictor-like grip on much that goes on, and Montana is the nearest to a colony of any American state." So when we talk about good people of Montana, the good men of Montana standing up, speaking up, rising up, throwing off the copper collar, it is not hyperbole, it is the reality. And that is what the good people of Montana did in 1914. And that is the story that I want to celebrate with you. It's the people of Montana, the strength, the integrity, the ethics, the work-heartedness, maybe the hard-heartedness, the heart of the people of Montana. And that we need to be proud of and celebrate, and also to emulate, in my opinion. So, not sure I have another slide. Oh yeah, I do. So, this is Jeanette. She is speaking on the day of her swearing in as the first woman in the United States Congress in 1917, because she was elected in 1916. We had an at-large system where we had two representatives, and they were not confined to the East and West. They were at large. And Jeanette, because she had been in every county in Montana during the suffrage movement, people knew her. And when I told you about what people said of her, that was a person you trusted, that was a person you liked, that you wanted to be your voice. And so the people of Montana elected Jeanette to the U.S. Congress. And what is interesting, she was the first woman, right? We know that story. She was the first woman elected. She could have been the second or third woman, because California and Colorado also ran women for Congress that year. But guess which state knew what needed to get done? And guess which state did it? It was Montana. And that, again, is part of our legacy and who we are as Montana. So thank you for listening to this story, and I hope it inspires you.
Green, we'll take some questions now. I'll bring the microphone to anybody that has a question.
Thank you. That was very inspiring. They should make a movie about her life. I don't understand how or why the Anaconda Company and Amalgamated and all those outfits, how did they know women were so progressive that they wanted to keep them away from the vote? How did they know that? I mean,
I am not I can't answer that fully. I can just tell you my sense. It's because they could control the vote of the men. When I say that the men in a certain precinct in Butte had to vote a certain way, they had to vote a certain way. I mean, in these books, they talk about whole sections of men losing their job. Now, they don't quote the source. I don't know if that's 100% true. I don't know if it was like urban legend or hearsay or the threat, so it always happened that they voted the way, but they were told how to vote. And they can't tell a woman how to vote. I mean, they have no retribution if a woman doesn't vote. So that is a really good question, and I honestly don't know the answer. What do you think?
probably because they had wives.
I'll just say that I don't know about all the issues, but like temperance, which you brought up, that the liquor companies were against women getting the vote. Temperance was really a women's movement, and it was started and seen as women's rights because of the whole idea of domestic violence and stuff like that. It was, sort of traced it back to alcohol, and so women's safety. And that's why, we think of prohibition now as being like, oh, they all just hated drinking and having fun. But the original idea was very much a feminist one about protecting women in their own homes. And before women had the vote, they were still able to write op-eds in the newspaper and stuff and sort of spread their ideas, so it was well known that, some of the issues that women cared about, although obviously the ballot's secret, so maybe some things were a surprise.
Yeah, which is really interesting because they treated the suffrage, in order to pass women's suffrage in Montana, they had to treat prohibition with hands off. They did not overtly say it because they knew that they would be directly attacked by it. And of course, they were attacked anyway. But because they knew Montana was a wet state. It truly was a drinking state, that they would probably lose a few votes if they really pushed the prohibition. So they just didn't talk about it. They talked about but they had a whole host of other things to talk about. Mine disasters and workman's comp issues and clean water and clean air and all of the things like brought in that suit. The Deer Lodge County was very well aware that this mining impacted their livelihood as an agricultural community. And so I think they had so much other that they could campaign on that they could kind of keep the prohibition behind, except Maggie Smith Hathaway in Ravalli. I mean, that was where they really brought in the vote because she really hammered home the prohibition. So that was a good question.
What bothers me about this is 2024, and it seems exactly the same to me, that we have these people in Congress that back a despicable man because they're scared they're not going to have their power anymore, or they'll be run out of office, what has changed? It seems like nothing. It's awful. it's more of a statement than it is a question, but it just, I don't get it.
I don't want to take the limelight from Jeanette, but what about the history of the family? Well, I mean, she left.
Say
And
what
she
again?
was, Jeanette left. She went east, and then she was a very busy person. Like, what happened with the family? Did they continue to operate farms and sawmills? Were the other children grown up enough to, like, take, because she's out there with looking at the orphanages, and I'm like, okay, they lost their father. They lost, obviously, a leading family member, young or not. Like, what happened that you know with the family and the business? And
That's a really good question because I don't know what happened in the interim, except Wellington may have come in to stabilize the family farm, and they may have sold it right away. I don't know, and then kept their house in Missoula because, but all of her sisters were, and Wellington, of course, were educated, and they didn't stay on the farm, and none of them did. Because, well, Wellington was the only boy, and then all of the other sisters married, and they went on to get degrees. They were all educated. So isn't that interesting that they didn't stay
yeah,
on
there
the
wasn't a
farm?
clear timeline, and I'm like, well, from that family photo, there was some young kids, like 5 years old, it looked
Yeah.
like, or 4 years old, and you're like, she was gone while they were growing up. So, like, what happened? It seemed that way. My timing might be off.
I don't know the date of that picture, but Wellington was only 11 or 12. I mean, if you look at that. So she was only maybe 17 in that picture. I don't have the date of that picture, but so I'm guessing like you. So the two twins, Edna and Grace. But I know Edna grew up to become a McKinnon. She was Edna Rankin McKinnon, related to our McKinnons in Missoula. And she went on to really work on contraception.
So there's another thing we never hear about,
Yeah.
which
I
would have
know.
been a big thing,
Yeah,
kind of tied right back into this.
yeah. So thank you. That's a really good point. I don't know that story. That would be a fun story to figure out.
Just a little segue as far as the Anaconda Copper Company / Amalgamated Copper Company and all the pollution there. I have a friend who just a few months ago, she grew up in Anaconda, and her brother and his kids still live there, and they run a business there, and they've done quite well. But it just seems that I'm going way off. What I wanted to say is my friend's two sons are having 2 townhouses built in Anaconda. And in order to build there, you have to have the soil tested. And there is so much pollution that they have to come in and scrape and scrape and scrape and have it retested just so you can get a permit to build. So, and my friend said when she was in high school, the one hill never had trees on it. And now that the plant is not running, there's no pollution coming out of that stack and everything, now that hill has trees on it. So, you know, what they did back then still affects what's going on there today. But most people don't know the history. They just worship, you know, they brought the money into the city.
Thank you for sharing that, because I think that's truth. I
Well,
mean, that is truth.
It's 7:30 now. Let's end the formal part, and if anybody'd like to come up and talk with Suzette, they
Yes.
can. We've been here an hour and a half, and we thank you very much for
Yeah.
an informative program. You have a lot of enthusiasm for your subject, we can see.
For
So,
Montana.
yeah.
It's for Montana.
So thank you all for coming, and we hope to see you next session on the War of 1812, because I don't think you know very much about it, because I helped him with his slides, and I was learning every slide practically, something new. So thank you very much. Good night.